Glad to see many of you out here today. This is an issue that affects us all, so if we don't stand up now, we may be having to sit on the sidelines, and I, for one, don't like sitting on the sidelines. So the first person that's going to speak to us today is from the Labor Center here on campus, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about what's happening in Wisconsin and Ohio and Indiana and why. Please welcome Eve Weinbach.
It's great to see so many people here. There's some seats in the front. Come on up. I'm just going to give you a couple minutes of background on what's happening, where it came from, and what we need to take away from all of this. What's happening in Wisconsin, first of all, is just a more extreme version of what's happening all over the U.S. There are 22 states right now that are proposing similar kinds of legislation that would take away democratic rights of working people in the public sector to organize and negotiate over the terms and conditions of their employment. So it's not just Wisconsin. Governor Walker, like the governors of these other states, have said that working people in the public sector are the cause of the state's budget crisis. So we know that that's not true, so what's wrong with this argument? Well, two things. First of all, there isn't a budget crisis. At least in Wisconsin, there wasn't a budget crisis until Governor Walker took over and decided to give $140 million in tax cuts to the biggest corporations that were coming into the state, including Walmart and companies like that. Then he turned around and said, now we have a budget crisis and we need to cut the wages of working people. We know that this isn't the real logic behind what he's doing, because working people had already agreed to cuts in their pensions, cuts in their health care, and so the financial issues weren't at stake anymore. It's really a case of what Naomi Klein calls the shock doctrine, which is taking advantage of a crisis to do what's been on the agenda all along. So what are they actually proposing in Wisconsin and fighting against right now? Some of you probably know all of these things, but it's pretty extreme. They're proposing taking away the rights of workers and unions to negotiate on anything except wage increases. And even then, they wouldn't be able to negotiate anything more than what they determine as the cost of living. So all of our rights to negotiate around our working conditions and things that go into our job, we would lose. Second, eliminating the dues checkoff. No one has to pay dues. Unions can't collect dues automatically anymore. Third, they're telling unions that they have to have a new election every single year to see if people still want the union or not. So imagine spending the time each year to organize around a new election just to keep going. And finally, they want to end collective bargaining rights for lots of workers. The recently organized home health care workers, family child care workers, all the workers at the university hospital, and all faculty and staff at the university would completely lose their collective bargaining rights. So this is really serious. Like I said, other states have similar things going on. In Michigan, there's some really extreme legislation that would make ergonomic standards in the workplace illegal, that would basically take away health and safety protections that have been negotiated for years. In Ohio and Indiana, they're talking about making project labor agreements illegal and other kinds of agreements on working standards. So this is happening everywhere. I think the important thing to know is that it's not just a bunch of Republicans who woke up one morning and had the same dream and decided to do all these things. It's part of a strategy, and it's part of a mobilization campaign by corporations and their allies in politics for at least 30 years. Really what we're seeing now is the perfect storm of three things. One is a real financial crisis. The second is a long campaign to weaken unions in the private sector. It's been incredibly successful. We used to have about more than 30% of workers in the private sector had unions, and now it's about 7% of workers in the private sector. The result is that you see wages going down, benefits and protections on the job going down, and then they turn around and say, hey, how come those public sector workers are doing so well? They've got all these things that the private sector workers don't have anymore. So you can turn around and blame it on the public sector. And the third thing is an attack on government. It was almost 20 years ago, Grover Norquist, who's a Republican strategist, said his goal was not to get rid of government, but to shrink it to the size that you could drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub. And that's the third strand of it. So by going after public employees, you can go after all of these enemies at once. We know that there's huge money behind this campaign. The billionaire Koch brothers have gotten a lot of press. They were the largest contributors to Governor Walker's campaign and a lot of state campaigns. They earned about $96 billion last year, each year, in revenues from their company, and they're working to make sure that that unions are disappearing in the private sector and the public sector. At the same time, if we want to talk about an economic crisis, we have to look at what's happened on Wall Street. The people who caused the financial crisis haven't paid for it at all. In fact, last year Wall Street had its second most profitable year ever by some measures. I was listening to a radio show and people were complaining that their bonuses had gone way down, so that this year their end of the year average bonus at the investment banks was only $130,000. But their salaries went up by enough to make up for it. So corporate profits in general rose by 28%, and yet we're saying that they're the ones who need the tax cuts and we're the ones who need to pay. The good news is that obviously there's a huge mobilization going on all around the country. We're a tiny part of that here. It's happening in Wisconsin, but it's happening everywhere. And this past weekend there were 100,000 people marching in Wisconsin. We're seeing some of the largest protests we've seen ever in a lot of states around the country. There's this incredible solidarity, and I think that's what we've got going on right here in Wisconsin. You saw the workers who weren't affected by the proposed legislation, the police and firefighters who are the governor's friends, are in there in the State House protesting with the workers. And it's incredibly inspiring. People in Egypt are sending pizzas. So that's the model for the rest of us, and people are going to talk about what to do. And the last piece of good news is that the general public is on our side. People get it. All of the polls that have come out recently have shown that people don't necessarily know a whole lot about unions, but large majorities of people think that attacking public sector workers is not the way to balance budgets. People would rather see tax increases. People understand that these are, in a lot of cases, low-paid workers, in a lot of cases women and people of color, and we have to protect their work and not cut it. So we're not the ones who caused the economy to crash. The economy can't be balanced on our backs. We know it, and we're fighting back, and that's what people are going to talk about now.